It was a typical summer day. Me and a few friends of mine were playing late-night football in my backyard. Our parents were over at a neighbor's place for a house party. After a while, we decided to go inside. We were browsing the internet, seeing a few people doing the Bloody Mary challenge. It was the usual, people saying her name in the dark bathroom, screaming as they claimed to see her, and then the video ends. My best friend, Josh, smirked and suggested we do the challenge ourselves. "Are you crazy? No way," one of my friends, Paris, said. She sounded pretty scared, and I shrugged. "Don't worry, it's not real," I stated. Josh chuckled and grabbed a few candles as his cousin Daniel grabbed my dad's camera and turned it on. We got ready and headed into my basement bathroom to make it more creepy. I lit the candles with the lighter I had, then we closed the door and turned off the lights. I sat the candles on either side of the mirror. By then, Josh and Daniel were so excited they were bouncing uncontrollably. I had Paris hold the camera. I still had the football with me and gripped it hard as Josh, Daniel, and I all said her name in unison. After a few seconds, nothing happened, and I sighed. "See, Paris, nothing happened," I said. I looked at her. She looked pale, and I looked at her worried. "Paris, you okay?" Josh asked. We then heard ragged breathing, but it wasn't coming from any of us. It was coming from the mirror. Shakily, we all turned to it, and we saw her. A girl in the mirror, another figure in the room with us, only in the mirror. The girl banged on the glass from the other side as we all screamed. Then I swear she reached out, her nails digging into my football and popping it. We hauled tail out of there, escaping to the neighbor's house. We told my parents and they came straight back to the house. We saw shattered glass from the mirror and a broken camera. My parents were mad. They told me to just stay at Paris's house for the night so they could figure out what to do with me. It's been years since then, and I just started college, sharing a house with Paris, Josh, and Daniel. I'd be lying if I didn't admit the feelings of being watched we all have even still, especially when we stand in front of a mirror. Whenever I hear a Mothman story, it tends to be rather personal to me, and even sometimes frustrating, as I've had my own encounter with this creature, which is quite different from other stories you may have heard. For context, I grew up in the suburbs of northern Ohio, right outside some big cities. The thing with Ohio is that you're never more than 20 minutes away from some rural parts. Therefore, I was well versed in both city and country living. My parents, on the other hand, were amateur ghost hunters and frequently went out of town to ghost hunt. One spot they came across was a small city in West Virginia named Point Pleasant. Any fan of cryptozoology or the paranormal would know of this place. So it was no surprise when my parents fell in love with that area. So much so that when I was about 13, my family bought 100 acres of land, a mere 20 or so miles from the town, right along the Ohio River. It was our little retreat where we would go every other weekend to escape the drag of everyday life. Now, our property has much history on it, allegedly. According to legend, a now dead Shawnee chief cursed our land and the surrounding lands. Ever since we got there, I've heard of a werewolf sighting happening in town just last October, and my mother herself swears she saw a little boy roaming our campsite. But none of these come even relatively close to my encounter with the ominous and legendary Mothman of Point Pleasant. As most of you probably already know, Point Pleasant is one of the first locations the Mothman has ever been seen, for the most part, so it was a must for my family and friends to go out and explore the areas he is said to roam. As practically everyone in our town has had an encounter, we asked around town first for some good leads, and a lot of good online research shows that the Mothman lives in these old World War II bunkers just a few miles north of town. Allegedly, the bunkers were old bomb warehouses in the 40s and 50s, but after the war, the government closed up the bunkers and turn the surrounding land into a state park, patrolled by park rangers. Naturally, we sped through the back roads until we found the park, and after an hour of driving around the forest in broad daylight, we decided to get out and finally walk around. Immediately, we came to these paths with chains going across, eliminating vehicular travel, so we walked through. About 100 yards down the trail, we came upon a small clearing. Immediately walking into this clearing, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart seemed to skip every other beat. There, on the other side of the small clearing, stood a large concrete bunker, overgrown with the forest around it, like nature had reclaimed its territory. I honestly did not expect to find anything there, so upon seeing this, the story suddenly became that much more real. Gathering our courage, my friend and I walked up to the bunker together, which was clearly padlocked with one of those really heavy solid steel padlocks. The first thing and probably most intimidating thing we noticed was the bright caution sign on the door, warning us of highly explosive contents. That was scary enough in and of itself. But being the idiotic 16-year-old I was, I laughed to my friends to try to impress them, and I put my ear against the solid metal door, listening in for anything. But it was silent. I then grabbed the long metal door handle and shook the door with all of my might. But of course it barely budged, despite being probably 60 or 70 years old. We took plenty of pictures, and then moved to find more bunkers all on separate paths down the road a bit more. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, but for some reason, my mother refused to return to that first bunker we came across. All she would say was that it gave her an uneasy feeling of dread, and she desired to puke the closer she got. This was honestly kind of unnerving to hear. My mother has dealt with far worse things many times before, often with the supernatural, and she has been barely fazed by those. But something was different about this place. Beyond that, nothing happened regarding the Mothman for a while. That was until this summer, nearly 2 years later. This happened about a month and a half ago. Myself and 5 of my closest friends all went on a camping trip to my parents' property near Point Pleasant in the hopes that we could enjoy one last outing together, as most of us were leaving for the military relatively soon. At the time, we were all 18 except for our friend Dylan, who was 25. It was our first night there. We were sitting around the campfire telling jokes and stories, just being average teenagers. All in all, our night was going really well, until about 3 in the morning, when my friend Dylan excused himself to go to the bathroom. The rest of us continued on hanging out and laughing, when a few moments later, Dylan returned with a concerned expression on his face. When we asked him what was up, he told us it sounded like a deer was wounded down the slope a little bit. He was a big animal guy, despite being a stone-faced Army combat veteran, which made us chuckle a little bit. I told him that as we're on top of a mountain, the sound travels very well, and that it was probably nothing, but he insisted that it was nearby and that we had to go check it out. So, admittedly a little curious myself, I agreed, and our friends Brian and Luke stayed by the camp, while Dylan, Han, Mickey, and myself went over to check it out. As soon as we left the vicinity of the fire, we could hear the groans of a wounded deer carrying through the trees. It did indeed sound close, so we followed the noise until we reached a large ravine with no way across. We stopped to assess our situation, and we noticed the cries of the deer had suddenly stopped. In fact, every night creature had stopped making any kind of noise, and only the gentle flow of the wind through the trees remained. This creeped us out, wondering if there was a predator nearby, as bears, mountain lions, and coyotes, and all sorts of poisonous snakes roamed these woods. Dylan and myself thankfully brought guns. He was carrying a 12-gauge Remington shotgun, and I had with me a semi-automatic Colt AR-15, both very capable of handling a bear or mountain lion. After 15 minutes of searching for a way to cross the ravine, we gave up, and we began to head back the way we came. But the moment we got about 5 steps away, the groaning of the deer started again, louder and more drawn out than before, so we turned around. But again it stopped. This irritated my friend Han, who then stomped down toward the edge of the ravine, shining his light below. Just then, his flashlight cut out, and before anyone else could react, we all felt a massive gust of air, along with an enormous presence, looming before us. But we could see nothing but black. Then the ground beneath me gave out, and Han and I found ourselves tumbling down the ravine. We both hit the bottom hard, and we got up quickly. We scrambled for the flashlight or the gun, or anything to use to feel less defenseless. We could hear yelling and running above us as I scrambled for the rifle. Then it all went by like a blur, until we found ourselves back at the top of the ravine, gun in hand, running back to our campsite. We ran for what seemed like an hour, despite only hiking 15 minutes down the ravine. We both dropped instinctively when a shotgun blast rang through the air, and as we got back up, another shot went off, and another, and then silence. It was only then that I realized my leg was bleeding and Han was crying. We sat for a few moments listening and scanning the trees around us, when suddenly Han grabbed my shoulder and yelled for me to shoot it. Just shoot the thing. At that, I sprung around to see 2 red eyes staring at us from a tall tree. It was only about 200 feet away and 30 feet up. I froze, and I was unable to shoot. I was mesmerized by those blood-red eyes. They seemed to have a glow about them. My sense of ease scared me even more, and it clearly shook Han as he just grabbed my shoulder and ran. We ran as fast as we were humanly capable of, until we finally broke onto the ridgeline into the camp, where everyone else was already scrambling. Immediately, we packed our things, got into the truck, and peeled out of there as fast as possible. No one spoke the whole way home, and it was only after 3 days of being back that we asked Dylan what happened with him and Mickey. He said that they began to run back, and upon realizing we weren't following, they turned back, where this thing, as he said, stepped into their path. He said he didn't have time to study its body. All he noticed was its immense height, wings, and those damned red eyes. He said that he thought it was a man, us perhaps, before he noticed those eyes. He said he didn't think, he just reacted, and shot at the thing multiple times, then turned back. But Mickey never had a chance to see it like he did. None of us except Han told our parents, and Hans didn't believe them apparently, and now he won't ever bring it up. Since then, I've been obsessively researching the Mothman, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is what we saw in those woods. Since then, my family has returned to our property multiple times, and we've had no weird encounters with the Mothman, surprisingly. Was he hunting us for stalking too close to his home at those bunkers? I don't really know. But I do plan on returning to the bunkers to find out more about this creature. So maybe there will be another tale to tell soon. Though I admit, I get cold sweats now when I simply think about going back there. A while back, I posted a story detailing my encounter with the ominous Mothman of Point Pleasant. I promised to return to the bunkers from the encounter, and I did. This happened about 3 or 4 months after the first incident. None of my friends from the first encounter went back. They either didn't want to go, or they left for the military. So my good friends Alex and Jess volunteered to tag along. Both Alex and Jess have had paranormal encounters of their own, so you could say we were all more or less prepared for the trip. We brought flashlights, a professional-grade camera, survival gear, and paranormal equipment, including my parents' K2 EMF detector, which picked up on electrical and magnetic impulses, generally given off by paranormal entities. At least that's what I read online. We got down to our property, which was about 20 miles from Point Pleasant and the Mothman bunkers. It was about 1 a.m. when we pulled up to the campsite, so it was pitch black. The first thing any of us noticed was the way it felt. The usually peaceful hilltop was silent and eerie. It felt distinctly like something was watching us from the tree line. We grabbed our bags and immediately crowded into the camper, where we locked the doors and drew the shutters. After about an hour, we settled down, forgetting all about that creepy feeling and managing to catch some sleep. At about 6 a.m., I woke up to make some coffee, and I found that Jess was already awake. She asked if I would go outside with her, so she could smoke a cigarette, as we all three agreed not to venture out alone past dark. We sat there watching the sun barely begin to shed its rays over the trees, and we just made small talk. As she finished her smoke, we suddenly heard a light tapping coming from behind the camper, about 15 feet or so to our right. This freaked us both out, and we jumped up, immediately wishing we hadn't left our guns in the camper. As soon as we jumped, the noise stopped, and we heard crashing amongst the bushes behind the camper, as if something was running away from us back into the tree line. We bolted inside and locked the door, not venturing out until the sun was well above us in the sky. For the next couple of days, we wandered the town and our property, learning about colonial history and just enjoying the gorgeous sights. In town, we came across an obelisk where Chief Cornstalk of the Shawnee tribe was buried. He had been murdered by the early colonists, and is said to have originally cursed this land, and many believe his curse gave birth to the Mothman and the tragedies he invokes. We also noticed a prayer stone which was used by the Shawnee to ward off evil spirits with an offering. We kept that in mind if something were to go very bad. Later on, during the third night there, we were looking through the photos we took on the land, and we came across a picture Jess took of some cows on the land. The cows seemed disturbed by something, and as we zoomed in and enhanced, it became overwhelmingly clear that something was there. Something was watching us from the trees, and we hadn't even noticed. This shook us with fear, and we stayed up all night researching and pretty much just freaking out over what we have on photo. We decided the next evening we'd go to the bunkers. The following day, we rolled up to the bunkers with all our gear, ready to investigate. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening, and the sun was just beginning to set. We hiked up to the first bunker, where my mother felt the most disturbed with the K2 meter on. It was on the lowest level, meaning electronic and magnetic impulses were low, which was normal for the middle of the woods. As soon as the bunker came into sight, my heart nearly ripped from my chest. The closed and bolted door to the bunker was wide open. At that moment, the K2 meter spiked to the maximum level, meaning there was an extreme presence nearby. All my instincts told me to run, but our curiosity pushed us on into the bunker. Inside, the bunker was ice cold, and so dark my flashlight barely cut through the thick air. Jess sat near the door to take pictures, while I dared to venture a little further in. It was super quiet, and every little noise we made was amplified tenfold, echoing throughout the complex. Every picture Jess took sent a shiver down my spine, and we couldn't shake this morbid feeling of dread. Suddenly, there was a crashing of branches from outside. Alex yelled we had to go, so we hurried our way back to the entrance and out to the car, where we finally shook off that feeling of being followed. We decided to try a few more bunkers before we left, but none felt anything like the first. We couldn't shake that eerie feeling, and Alex became increasingly paranoid, which made Jess and I very on edge. As we got back in the car to finally leave, we saw headlights behind us, and as the truck passed by, it slowed to a crawl, but it was too dark to see who was driving. After they passed us, we pulled out to leave the woods when suddenly we saw the truck's taillights disappear. They didn't shift like it was turning or fade like they turned off. They simply ceased to be there. I didn't believe it, so I floored the gas, speeding up to nearly 60 miles per hour to catch this truck that was going no more than 25 on a straight, flat, narrow road. We made it to the end of the road in no time, but there was no truck. We all felt tingles down our spine. There was nowhere this truck could have turned or gone to escape our view. It just vanished. Nothing made any sense at this point, and as we drove back to the property, we went over every possible scenario that could have happened. The truck, the bunkers, the thing watching us in the distance by the cows. The bunker door looked as if someone or something had ripped it open from the inside, which would have taken an immeasurable amount of force, as outrageous as that may sound. We returned home the next day and looked at all the photos and recordings we took, now completely sure there's something stalking or flying through those darned woods in Point Pleasant. It happened when I was about 8 years old. There were always strange things happening at my grandparents' house, but this one experience still haunts me. My mom had taken me and my brothers and sister to my grandpa's house. Naturally, all of us kids were outside playing, being loud and running around near the woods. As the sun began to go down, I suddenly got a strange feeling that we were being watched. I told my older cousin, but he just brushed it off, telling me to come inside with everyone. So we all hung out in my Uncle Sean's room, playing his old Nintendo or Atari, I can't remember which. After a couple of hours, when it was completely dark out, I got that strange feeling again, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked over to my cousin, and I was about to say something when we both looked towards the window. That's when I saw him. A little boy with pale white skin and deep red hair was staring at us. The most horrific part about this was his eyes. They were solid black, black as coal, staring back at us. Whenever I looked into his eyes, I felt a wave of negativity, and a deep, almost primal fear took hold of me. Just as I was about to scream, my grandpa came running into the room. He glanced at the window, then charged outside, yelling at the boy in Cherokee to go away, that he's bad, that he's not welcome here. I had never seen him so angry in my entire life. After that day, we were not to play outside after dark. I have listened to several black-eyed kids' stories, and the one thing that's missing is an accurate description of the fear you feel when you lock eyes with one of these creepy little guys.